Nobody in the palace was supposed to find the room unlocked. It had been sealed for 11 months, ever since the staff catalogued the late Queen's private effects at Balmoral. The inventory listed everything with meticulous precision: correspondence folders, personal journals, annotated prayer books, a small leather box of Commonwealth mementos. But one item had been deliberately withheld from the official record. The archivist knew it existed, the private secretary knew, and one member of the royal family had known for years, carrying the secret the way you carry a stone in your shoe. Not crippling, but never entirely forgotten, the letter itself was unremarkable to look at. Cream stationery, neat, compressed handwriting. The kind of correspondence Elizabeth had produced 10,000 times over 7 decades: notes of condolence, letters of encouragement, private replies to foreign heads of state. But what was written inside this particular envelope, sealed with red wax, and addressed in a hand that had grown slightly less certain in its final months, was unlike anything the palace had ever handled before. It wasn't a legal document, it didn't alter the succession, it didn't redistribute titles or revoke any privilege. What it did was something far more difficult to contain. It named a 9-year-old girl as the guardian of the British monarchy's moral future, and it explained in precise, unsparing language exactly why the adults surrounding that child had already partially failed the institution they were meant to protect. Charles discovered the letter on a Tuesday morning in October. He had been scheduled for a routine engagement in the afternoon, a visit to an agricultural college in Wiltshire, but the private secretary had called ahead to cancel without offering a reason. The king had arrived at Windsor to find the archive room unlocked, a single envelope waiting on the reading table, and a handwritten instruction taped to the door. The instruction was in his mother's writing. It said simply that the envelope was to be opened only by the reigning sovereign, alone, before any other person was consulted. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. The private secretary had already withdrawn. The corridor behind him was empty. Charles stepped inside and closed the door. What he read over the next 40 minutes would shake the composure that royal training had spent 70 years building. Not because the letter was an attack, not because it was cruel. What made it devastating was that it was considered. Every sentence had been revised. Every word had been chosen with the kind of precision that only comes from someone who has watched an institution closely for a very long time and has grown, in its final years, genuinely afraid for it. Elizabeth wrote that she had loved her son without qualification. She wrote that she believed in his intelligence, his commitment, and his capacity to modernize the crown in ways she herself had been too cautious to attempt. She wrote all of this first, and she wrote it at length, because she wanted what followed to be understood as honesty between equals, rather than a judgment passed from above. Then she said the thing that Charles would spend the next 3 days attempting to absorb. She said that there were qualities the monarchy now desperately needed, qualities she had looked for among her children and grandchildren for the past 2 decades, and that she had finally found them, clearly and unmistakably, not in an adult who had been shaped by palace life, but in a child who had not yet been fully claimed by it. She had found them in Charlotte. The king placed the letter on the table when he reached that page. He didn't put it down the way you put something down when you've finished with it. He placed it carefully, almost reverently, the way you handle something that has changed its weight while you were holding it. Then he sat for a long time without moving. Camilla found him an hour later. She had been told nothing specific, only that he had canceled the afternoon engagement and asked not to be disturbed. When she pushed open the archive room door and saw him sitting at the reading table with both hands pressed flat against the surface and his eyes focused on some point beyond the wall, she understood immediately that this was not a minor matter. She had been married to this man long enough to know the specific quality of his silences. This one was different from grief. It was closer to the silence of someone recalibrating everything they thought they understood about a story they believed they already knew the ending to. He held the letter without offering it to her. He told her that his mother had written it before she died. He told her it concerned Charlotte. And then, because the second sealed page had contained an explicit instruction about sequence. William must be told before Camilla. Charlotte must be told before it became known to any household official. He said only that the contents would be shared with her in full, but not yet. He needed a day. He needed to understand it himself before he could explain it to anyone else. What Camilla did next revealed a great deal about the woman the public had only imperfectly come to know. She didn't push. She didn't express the hurt that was plainly visible in the set of her jaw. She nodded once, asked whether he needed anything brought to the room, and withdrew when he said no. The exclusion stung. It was designed to sting, gently, honestly. Elizabeth had calibrated even that detail. William arrived at Windsor the following morning without knowing why he had been summoned. He had received a call from his father's private secretary the previous evening. Charles wished to see him at Windsor, no advisors, no staff, just the two of them, as early as convenient. The phrasing was careful. It didn't alarm him exactly, but it sent a particular signal. When a senior royal requests a private meeting without offering a reason, the request itself is the information. He found his father in the same room. The letter was on the table between them, along with the second sealed page, which Charles had opened overnight. He pointed to the chair opposite him without preamble. He said they needed to talk about Charlotte. The next 2 hours were unlike any conversation William had experienced within the palace. His father began by drawing a distinction that Elizabeth had laid out carefully in the letter. The legal succession, the constitutional order determining who inherits the throne, was not in question. George remained the direct heir after William. Nothing in Elizabeth's letter touched that arrangement. What the letter concerned was something different, something harder to define and far harder to protect. The monarchy, Elizabeth had written, possessed 2 kinds of inheritance. The first was legal, formal, and largely automatic. The second was moral, earned, and frighteningly fragile. She called it the Crown Legacy. It was the accumulated weight of 70 years spent earning public trust through restraint rather than performance, through steadiness rather than spectacle, through genuine service rather than the appearance of it. And she believed it was in danger. She had not written this out of pessimism. She had written it because she loved the institution too much to leave a comfortable lie behind her. The crown could survive a great deal, she wrote. It had survived abdication, scandal, tragedy, and the erosion of deference over an entire century. What it could not survive indefinitely was the slow, quiet disappearance of the quality that had always made it credible, the sense that the people at its center understood service as something larger than personal reputation. William absorbed all of this carefully. He was not a man who showed emotion quickly or carelessly. But the next section of the letter, which Charles read aloud in a voice that was carefully controlled but not entirely steady, broke through the professional composure. Elizabeth wrote that she had spent the last several years of her life quietly watching each member of the family. Not with suspicion, not with disappointment, with genuine attention. She had watched how they behaved when they believed the formal occasion was the only thing being observed, and she had watched with particular intensity during the informal moments in between. The arrivals and departures, the waiting rooms and side corridors, the brief, unscripted intervals when palace life briefly suspended its staging and people simply behaved as themselves. She had recorded what she saw. She had filled a small blue notebook, the same notebook now sitting beside the letter on the reading table, with private observations extending across nearly 4 years. And across those 4 years, she had seen something unexpected emerge. Not in the adults who had been shaped by royal expectation. In a child who had not yet learned to perform, Charlotte had been 8 years old the first time Elizabeth noted her name in the notebook. The occasion was a private family service at St. George's Chapel, held in the winter, attended only by the core family and a small household staff. Nothing significant was scheduled. It was a service of the kind the family attended regularly, structured, quiet, and largely routine. What made it exceptional was a small failure in the choreography. A young page, a junior attendant responsible for carrying a ceremonial object during the processional, had stumbled on the stone floor near the entrance. He was perhaps 15. He had dropped what he was carrying, recovered it clumsily, and then frozen in place as a senior household official spoke sharply to him in a low, urgent voice. The family was moving past him. The correct thing, from a protocol perspective, was to continue moving. A stumble by a junior attendant during a private service was not an event that warranted acknowledgement from the principal family members. Everyone understood this implicitly. The adults kept walking. Charlotte stopped. She stepped out of the processional line without appearing to deliberate about it, crouched beside the boy, and picked up the item he had fumbled. She handed it back to him without ceremony. Then she said something to him, quietly enough that no one nearby could hear the exact words. What was visible was his response. His breathing steadied. The rigidity left his shoulders. He moved back into position and completed his role without further incident. The entire episode lasted perhaps 40 seconds. William had seen it and had moved immediately to recall his daughter to the line. He remembered being mildly concerned, not angry, simply attentive to the fact that Charlotte had broken formation during a formal occasion and protocol existed for reasons. He had started toward her when Elizabeth raised one hand. It was the smallest possible gesture. It stopped him entirely. He waited, watching his daughter finish what she had started, and said nothing. He had not understood what his grandmother had seen until his father read from the notebook the following morning at Windsor. Elizabeth had written 3 entries about that chapel moment across 2 separate dates, which meant she had returned to it. She had thought about it enough to think about it again. What she had written was not a sentimental observation about a sweet child performing a kind act. It was a clinical note from someone who had spent 7 decades studying how power behaves when it believes itself unobserved. She wrote that Charlotte had not looked around before she stopped. She had not checked to see who was watching. She had not calculated the cost to her own positioning or the awkwardness of stepping out of line in front of a senior official. She had simply seen a frightened person and moved toward them. Elizabeth wrote that this particular combination, the absence of calculation combined with the presence of genuine attention, was the rarest quality she had ever tried to identify in a royal context. She had seen ambition dressed as compassion many times. She had seen performance dressed as service throughout her reign. What she had almost never seen was the real thing, unadorned and unrehearsed, and visible only in the moments when no one expected to be tested. William stood up from the table when his father finished that section. He walked to the window. He stood there for a while without speaking, looking out at the Windsor grounds in the pale October light. When he turned back, his expression had shifted from the controlled attentiveness he had maintained for the previous hour into something more complicated. He told his father that he was proud. Of course he was proud, but he was also afraid. He said that what he was hearing sounded less like an honor being offered to his daughter and more like a claim being placed on her. He asked directly whether Elizabeth had considered what it would mean for Charlotte to grow up, knowing that her great-grandmother had identified her as the person most qualified to carry a burden that adults with lifetimes of preparation had found crushing. Charles did not deflect the question. He said his mother had anticipated it precisely, and then he read the passage Elizabeth had written in response to the objection she apparently knew would come. She had written that any designation she left behind must carry the freedom to be refused. The letter was not a command. The ring she had specified, a piece she had worn privately during moments of personal national crisis, never publicly, never ceremonially, was not a symbol of appointment. It was an invitation. Charlotte must be allowed to grow to adulthood without being told the content of the letter until her parents judged the moment right. She must never be coached or shaped toward the qualities that had already formed naturally in her. She must never be positioned as a rival to her brother, because the crown legacy was not a throne and couldn't be inherited through competition. It could only be lived or allowed to disappear. Then Charles revealed the detail that changed the tone of the entire conversation. He said that one person had been consulted during the preparation of the letter. One member of the family had been brought into confidence while Elizabeth was still alive. One person had known about the notebook, the observations, and the eventual intention behind them, and had kept the secret for 3 years. Annie entered the room without knocking about 20 minutes later. She had known the letter had been opened. She had been told by the private secretary, who was the single household official Elizabeth had permitted to know of the document's existence. She came in without an aide, sat down across from William without offering an explanation or an apology, and looked at her nephew with the direct, unsentimental expression that had defined her public personality for 50 years. William asked her how long she had known. She told him, 3 years and 4 months. She had been at Balmoral during one of Elizabeth's final extended stays there, and the Queen had asked her to remain after the other family members left. They had spoken for 2 evenings. Elizabeth had shown her the notebook. She had explained her reasoning carefully, slowly, without any apparent urgency, the way someone explains something they have thought about so thoroughly that the thinking itself has become calm. She had asked Anne a single question at the end of the second evening. She had asked whether she was wrong. Annie told William she had said no. The future king asked her why she hadn't warned him. 3 years. 4 months of knowing that Elizabeth was building towards something that would affect his children and his family and his understanding of what his daughter's life might look like. He kept his voice level, but barely. Anne's answer was exact. She said a warning would have been a contamination. She used that word deliberately. If William had known that his mother was being observed against a particular standard, he would have watched Charlotte differently. Even without meaning to, he would have noted the moments she met the criteria. He would have felt pride in ways that were legible to her. He would have began, unconsciously, inevitably, to confirm what was being seen rather than allowing it to be discovered. Elizabeth had been very clear that the observation required genuine ignorance on the part of the subjects. Any awareness would have introduced performance. And the one thing Elizabeth was trying to find, the one quality she believed was most in danger of extinction in the context of royal life, was precisely the absence of performance. William looked at her for a long time. He finally said that he understood the logic and resented it in equal measure. Anne said that was probably the correct response. The harder conversation happened later that afternoon, in private, when Charles read Anne the passage from the notebook that concerned his own reign. Elizabeth had written about her son with the kind of love that doesn't flinch from the truth precisely because it is love. She had written about his intelligence, his genuine environmental commitment, his sensitivity to criticism, and his tendency to absorb it personally in ways that cost him energy he needed elsewhere. She had written that he was the right monarch for the transition the monarchy was passing through, the necessary modernizer, the bridge between her era and whatever came next. And then she had written that the bridge itself was not the destination. The destination was a monarchy that had found, again, the emotional register she believed it was losing. Not sentiment, not popularity. Something harder to fake and more durable than either. The sense that the people at its center were genuinely present to the lives of ordinary people, not performing presence, not strategically positioning themselves as relatable, but actually paying attention in the way Charlotte had paid attention to a frightened boy on a cold chapel floor, Charles closed the notebook after Anne finished reading it back to him. He sat with his hands in his lap. Then he asked her whether their mother had believed he was incapable of that quality. Annie said no. She said Elizabeth had believed he possessed it, but that it had been trained and pressed and managed and strategically deployed for so long that it had become difficult to distinguish from performance even for him. The same palace machinery that had shaped him had also, inevitably, enclosed him. Charlotte was different, not because she was better, but because she was earlier. She had not yet been fully claimed by the institution. She still moved through it the way an outsider moves through a formal space, with curiosity rather than reflex, with genuine response rather than conditioned protocol. Charlotte arrived at Windsor that evening believing she was coming for a family dinner. She was 9 years old. She was wearing the clothes she had chosen herself that morning, which her protection officer later noted were entirely unsuitable for a significant occasion, and she arrived in good spirits, slightly muddy from what appeared to have been an eventful afternoon outdoors. She found her grandfather waiting in a sitting room she didn't normally use. Her parents were already there. Her great-aunt was seated near the window. She looked at the assembled adults and asked if someone had died. It was the right instinct. When the principal members of a family gather unexpectedly without explanation, the most likely occasion is a loss. She wasn't far wrong. What was being lost, in a sense, was the comfortable fiction that she was simply a member of the family, identical in experience and expectation to her siblings, moving through childhood with no particular claim on the future, beyond the ordinary claims of family life. After this evening, that fiction would be gone. Charles began by telling her that her great-grandmother had left her something. He told her it was different from the things she had left to other people. Not jewelry, not keepsakes, not the kind of object you display or store. He said that Elizabeth had believed Charlotte carried something that the family needed, and that she had wanted her to know it while there was still time for the knowledge to be useful, rather than simply heavy. He read from the letter slowly. He paused in the places where Elizabeth's language became most direct, giving Charlotte time to absorb what was being said. The young princess listened without interrupting. She asked one question during the reading. She asked what a crown legacy was, exactly, because Charles had used the phrase twice, and she wanted to be sure she understood it correctly. He explained it as best he could. He said it was the difference between wearing something and being worthy of it. He said it was the part of the monarchy that couldn't be inherited automatically because it had to be earned, personally, repeatedly, in moments that were never formally arranged. Charlotte nodded and asked him to continue. When he reached the chapel section, the stumble the page, the 40 seconds outside the processional line, she went still. He watched her face reorganize itself around the memory, locating the specific morning, identifying the specific boy, and then arriving at the realization that someone had been watching with an attention she had never suspected. Her expression when she arrived at that realization was not pride. It was something more complicated than pride. It was closer to the expression of someone who has been seen doing something they believed was private, and who is now working out how they feel about visibility. Then she asked the question that Charles would tell William about privately, later that evening, with an expression the future king had never seen on his father's face before. She asked whether George knew about the letter. She had understood, in the space of that question, everything Elizabeth had feared and hoped for simultaneously. She had understood that what she was being offered could, if handled carelessly, look from the outside like an elevation, a preference, a ranking, a grandmother's quiet declaration that one child was more promising than another. She had understood this before either of her parents had fully put it into words, and her first instinct, before she said anything else, before she asked what the ring meant, or what Elizabeth expected from her, or what any of this would mean for the shape of her life, was to protect her brother from the story the world would tell about it. Charles told her George did not know yet. He told her that George would be told by his parents that same evening, with care and time and absolute clarity about what the letter did and did not say. He told her that the succession was unchanged, that George remained heir after William, and that nothing Elizabeth had written diminished the future her brother was moving toward. Charlotte said that wasn't what she was worried about. She said she knew George wouldn't care about the succession. He had grown up understanding the succession, the way you grow up understanding a climate, not a choice. What she was worried about was the story. She was worried about what people outside the family would say when they learned about the letter. She was worried about whether George would have to spend years reading headlines that compared them as though they were in a competition neither of them had entered. The adults in the room were quiet. For a moment after she said this, William looked at Catherine. Catherine looked at Charles. Anne, near the window, studied her hands. Then Charlotte asked to speak with her grandfather alone. She waited until her parents had stepped out before she said what she actually wanted to say. She told Charles that she would accept the ring and the responsibility attached to it, but on one condition. She wanted the letter placed somewhere George could read it when he was old enough. She didn't want to carry a private knowledge of her great-grandmother's trust while her brother remained unaware of it. She said she couldn't imagine maintaining something that meaningful in silence while growing up alongside someone she loved. The silence would change how she talked to him. It would create a distance she didn't want. The only way to accept Elizabeth's legacy without letting it become a weight was to share it. Eventually, with the person most affected by what it implied, Charles placed the ring in her hand. It was a simple piece, privately made, the kind of object that carried significance only in context. She turned it over once, looking at it carefully, and then she put it on. She kept her condition. That night, when the household had settled and Charlotte had gone to bed, Charles sat alone in the archive room with the letter, the notebook, and the 2 sealed envelopes that had contained them. He had spent most of his adult life in some relationship to his mother's legacy, aware of it, adjacent to it, measured against it by a public that had loved her with an intensity that made comparison almost cruel. He had assumed, without thinking about it very clearly, that the central task of his reign was to step out of that comparison and establish his own meaning for the crown. He still believed that. But the letter had added a layer he hadn't anticipated. It suggested that his role was not simply to define his own reign, but to carry the institution safely toward a generation that could restore what Elizabeth believed was quietly slipping away. He had expected to find grief in the archive room. He had not expected to find something that felt quietly and inconveniently like relief, like being seen accurately by someone who loved you, which is one of the rarest and most destabilizing experiences available to any person, and almost uniquely rare for a king. The story did not stay contained. It never does. Royal secrets have a particular half-life. Not long enough to die quietly, long enough to build pressure before the moment of release. The copied schedule had reached a journalist by the following afternoon. By the evening, the outline of the story was circulating among royal correspondents. Not the contents of the letter, which remained private, but the unmistakable shape of an extraordinary event. A letter from the late Queen, a family gathering at Windsor, a designation involving Charlotte that wasn't succession, but was clearly something. The palace authorized a statement the following morning. It was brief, carefully worded, and it said almost nothing while technically saying enough. It confirmed that the late Queen had left a letter intended for a member of the family. It confirmed the letter had been delivered and read. It stated, with emphasis, that the legal succession was unchanged, and that Prince George remained heir to the throne after the Prince of Wales. It described the letter's concern as one of personal family significance, relating to values and character, rather than any constitutional matter. The statement did almost nothing to contain the story. The coverage that followed moved through several stages rapidly. The first was confusion. Commentators who specialized in constitutional matters spent most of the first morning explaining, repeatedly and with varying patience, that legacy was not succession, that character was not rank, and that Elizabeth's letter, whatever it contained, could not and did not alter the legal order of inheritance. This was accurate and almost completely ineffective as a frame. The public did not hear a constitutional clarification. They heard that the longest reigning queen in British history had looked at her great-grandchildren and made a private judgment about which of them carried the qualities she most valued. And they heard that the answer was Charlotte. By the afternoon, the coverage had shifted from constitutional analysis to something closer to a cultural reckoning. What did it mean that compassion was the quality Elizabeth had chosen to prize above rank? What did it mean that she had found it in a child who had broken protocol to comfort a frightened junior attendant, rather than in any of the adults who had spent their lives in formal preparation for royal responsibility? What did it say about the institution, and about the people surrounding it, that the Queen's private judgment had apparently needed to go searching beyond the usual candidates to find the thing she was looking for? George watched the coverage from Windsor. He was old enough to understand most of it, and perceptive enough to feel the particular discomfort of having his own name used as a comparison point in a story he hadn't been told about. His mother sat with him for most of the morning. She explained, again more slowly and with more detail this time, what Elizabeth's letter did and did not say. She told him that his great-grandmother had loved him. She told him that nothing in the letter was a judgment against him, that his future was not threatened, that his relationship with his sister was not a competition and had never been intended as one. George listened carefully. Then he said he wanted to talk to Charlotte. He found her in the garden, which is where she had gone after breakfast, because the indoor atmosphere had acquired the specific pressure of a house in which everyone is trying very hard to be calm. He sat down beside her without preamble. She looked at him and waited. He told her he wasn't angry at her. He told her he wasn't jealous, exactly, though he admitted the word was in the vicinity of what he felt. What he actually felt, he said, was something he didn't have a very good word for. It was the strange sensation of having an important story told about your own family, in which you appear mostly as a reference point. Not the center of the story, not a villain in the story, just a fact in someone else's story, a benchmark. He said it was an odd thing to be. Charlotte said she understood. She said she had spent the previous evening feeling something similar, the peculiar disorientation of discovering that your most private impulses had been witnessed and recorded and assigned significance you hadn't known you were generating. She said it was like being told that a conversation you'd had in an empty room had been overheard for years. George was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her if she thought their great-grandmother had been right. Charlotte thought about the question seriously, which he had expected. She didn't answer immediately. She turned the ring on her finger once, the way you handle a new object before you've decided where it belongs in your life. Then she said she didn't know yet. She said she hoped so. She said that the thing Elizabeth had apparently seen in that chapel, the absence of calculation, the instinct to move toward fear rather than past it, she wanted that to be true about herself. She wanted it to be something real rather than something she had performed without realizing she was performing it. The only way to know was to keep living honestly enough that the answer eventually became clear. George held out his hand. She put the ring in it, the way she had with Charles the night before. He looked at it for a moment, then handed it back and told her to take care of it. They sat in the garden for another half-hour without speaking about the letter again. Charles appeared publicly 3 days later. At a scheduled engagement he declined to postpone. He arrived with William beside him, and George and Charlotte were present, standing together, close enough that a photographer would have struggled to get a clean shot of either child alone. It was a small calculation with a large intention. The palace had decided, and Charles had agreed, that the most powerful statement they could make in the aftermath of Elizabeth's letter was not a statement at all. It was an image. Not Charlotte ahead of George, not George apart from Charlotte. Both of them together in the same frame, in the same posture, with the easy, uncontrived closeness of two people who have known each other their entire lives and have recently found themselves in an unexpected situation and have chosen, without being told to face it facing the same direction. The image ran on the front page of every national paper the following morning. The coverage changed register almost overnight. Inside the palace, Charles made the final decision about the letter's preservation. It would be placed in the royal archives, the protected collection holding the monarchy's most sensitive records, with instructions that Charlotte would assume formal guardianship of it when she reached adulthood. The blue notebook would go with it, the ring she was already wearing. No ceremony, no announcement, no special designation that could be mistaken for a title or confused with succession. Just a private record, held safely, of what one extraordinary woman had believed about the future of the institution she had spent her life serving, and of the unexpected place she had found reason to hope. The monarchy's survival has always depended on a particular kind of faith. Not religious faith, but the more fragile, more ordinary faith that the people at the institution's center are genuinely present to the lives of those watching. That they understand service not as an obligation performed toward a public, but as an attention paid to specific people in specific moments. Elizabeth had spent 7 decades earning that faith through means so disciplined and consistent that they looked, from the outside, almost inevitable. But she had known they were not inevitable. She had known the whole time that each generation had to find its own version of the same honesty. And she had spent the final years of her life quietly watching for the person who might carry it forward. She had watched a morning chapel service. She had watched a 15-year-old boy drop something on a stone floor. She had watched a 9-year-old girl step out of line without looking around to see who was watching. And in that small, unrehearsed, 40-second moment, she had found something she had been looking for years. Not certainty, not a guarantee, something more useful than either. Evidence that the quality she most wanted to protect was still present in the family, still living in its least managed form, still visible in the brief intervals before palace life had time to shape it into something more controlled and therefore less trustworthy. The letter had said that Charlotte might one day be the person to carry this forward. It had not said she would. It had not commanded her to. It had simply said that Elizabeth had seen her, really seen her, in the way that matters most, without the distortion of expectation, without the inflation of ceremony, without the softening influence of love looking for what it wants to find. She had seen Charlotte exactly as she was, and what she had seen had given the old queen, in her final months, something she had not expected to feel again quite so strongly. Hope not the comfortable kind, the difficult kind. The kind that has looked at the evidence honestly and decided, in full awareness of how much can still go wrong, that it is warranted. That is what Elizabeth left behind. Not the letter itself, not the ring, not even the notebook with its careful private observations accumulated across 4 years. What she left behind was the record of a mind that had paid attention to the right things at the right moments and had the courage to say what it found, honestly, even to the people it loved most. Especially to the people it loved most. Charlotte turned 10 the following spring. The morning passed quietly, as she had apparently requested. There was no public statement, no palace image released to the press, no formal acknowledgement of any milestone beyond the one a 10-year-old actually cares about, which is the cake, and the people around the table, and the particular warmth of an ordinary morning in which nobody is asking you to be anything other than exactly yourself. She wore the ring. Nobody mentioned it. She had put it on that morning before coming down to breakfast, and she wore it throughout the day. And in the evening, when the family had gone quiet, she turned it on her finger once and thought about a frightened boy on a chapel floor and a great-grandmother who had been watching, and about what it means to be seen clearly by someone who loves you without needing you to be different from what you are. She thought about all of it for a while. Then she went to find George, because he had promised to beat her at chess before bed, and she intended to prevent it. And the ring caught the light as she moved down the corridor, and the corridor was quiet, and the palace was settling into the night around them, as it always had, as it always would, carrying forward every secret it had been trusted to keep.